Welcome to Mariculture Minute, a podcast about salmon, shellfish, and seaweed in Alaska. I'm Jeremiah Murphy. This is the second episode in our Kelp the Vote series about Alaska politics and ocean farming. In the last episode, we heard from three candidates in the race to be the next governor of Alaska: Click Bishop, James Parkin, and Tom Begich. In the episode, I had attended, or maybe even crashed, a campaign event for Tom Begich. In this episode, I'll read responses I got from a couple current incumbents, U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan and Rebecca Himschoot, who represents my town, Sitka, in the Alaska legislature. But first, a little postscript to the campaign event for Tom Begich. So I asked my questions. I was just wondering if Alaska could do anything to help out kelp farmers.
Yes, you could.
I got a couple answers. You can hear Begich's responses in the previous episode, but when the event was over, the person sitting in front of me turned around and wanted to ask me a few questions. They were concerned about the ecological impact of kelp farming. They asked if there was any kind of examination of an area before a kelp farm begins. I think they used the term impact statement. And they wondered if kelp farming was similar to going to a forest and cutting down trees. This was last November, and luckily for me, I had a test coming up in my Mariculture class. So I had some answers to these questions.
Yeah, it's very extensive permitting process. Takes a very long time. Involves fishing.
I said the application to start a kelp farm is a very long process that goes through
natural resources.
I think three state agencies: the Department of Natural Resources,
yeah, they do all
Fish
that.
and Game, and the Department of Environmental Conservation.
From what I'm learning, kelp farming is just basically putting anchors and lines in the water.
I talked about the mechanics of kelp farming. It's just putting anchors and lines in the water, and the kelp grows on the lines. There's no fertilizer or chemicals added.
They do what's called the genetic precautionary approach, where all the kelp that you grow has to be found within 50 kilometers of your farm.
I talked about the genetic precautionary approach in Alaska, where kelp farmers can only farm species from at most 50 kilometers from their farm. That's around 30 miles. Then that prevents the introduction of new species and new diseases. I don't know if I completely eliminated this person's concerns. They mentioned, more otters coming into an area with a kelp farm. They were wondering if a kelp farm would increase the otter population, I think, because there might be more sea urchins for the otters to eat. And then the otters might throw the ecosystem off balance because they start eating other things like abalone. And they were also concerned that people don't know, because seaweed farms are so new in Alaska, we don't know what the long-term effects on an ecosystem are in, 10 to 20 years. I don't know the answers to all these questions. I don't know how sea otters impact kelp farms, but I did find some articles that talk about them actually being beneficial and helping natural kelp forests by eating sea urchins. They eat, I think this one article said 15 pounds of shellfish a day. I love otters and am excited to investigate this more. But I think my conversation with this person did pass on some information they didn't previously know. This demonstrates the kind of conversations kelp and shellfish farmers have with their communities. How will your farm change things? I had some answers. The permitting process by state agencies answers some of these questions. The farms aren't putting any chemicals in the water. Seaweed and shellfish can even help with water quality. Seaweed farms can help prevent harmful algal blooms, which would help prevent paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is something we've talked about in a few episodes, where algae can create these toxins that get into the shellfish, and then if you eat the shellfish with these toxins, it can stop you from breathing and you can die. But I'm glad I got to hear community members' concerns, because maybe those kinds of questions can help make kelp farming better or more beneficial to a community. If an issue is brought up, it might introduce potential problems the kelp farmer hadn't thought about. That's my 2 cents. But enough of me answering questions. I'm hoping Senator Dan Sullivan has some answers. Dan Sullivan is up for re-election representing Alaska in the United States Senate. He is Republican. A Democrat, Mary Patola, entered the race a couple weeks ago. I had contacted her office before she entered the race with the same questions, but haven't heard back. I'm going to try again. I asked Senator Sullivan the following questions. What do you think would best promote kelp production in Alaska? Would you support a statewide program to monitor coastal waters for paralytic shellfish poisoning? What's your favorite shellfish or seaweed dish? Do you have any other thoughts on Alaskan mariculture? And I received a response from Sullivan's D.C. office, Sienna Joy, who helps the senator with ocean and fishery issues. Sienna wrote to me in November, and here are the answers. So, question 1. What do you think would best promote kelp production in Alaska? Answer. Senator Sullivan believes that maintaining our world-class sustainable seafood standards is essential to ensuring a lasting productive kelp industry. One key way to do this is incorporating tribal input and indigenous knowledge into kelp production and harvesting. For example, Alaska natives have sustainably harvested kelp for generations, and there are already several indigenous-led mariculture initiatives paving the way for sustainable kelp production. Senator Sullivan believes another essential way to promote kelp production in Alaska is reliable demand and market access. Alaska has many unique products that are loved not only by Alaskans, but by our visitors. Promoting kelp products both locally as well as in the tourism industry could be great ways to create a reliable market to help promote kelp production in Alaska. On ways the federal government can help promote kelp production, Senator Sullivan has for years been pushing for the establishment of an Office of Seafood at USDA. He's happy to say that a provision in the recent bill to open up the government included establishing a seafood industry liaison in the Department of Agriculture to advocate for Alaska's fishermen and coastal communities. This is a positive step towards the goal of the Office of Seafood at USDA. While Alaska Seafood benefits from USDA marketing and purchase programs, our seafood harvesters and producers often find that USDA programs, which are tailored for farmers and ranchers, are ill-fit for seafood. The Office of Seafood would be tasked with coordinating seafood policies and programs at the USDA and across federal agencies so that our producers and processors, including those in the kelp industry, can have all the support that other traditional commodities receive. NOAA is also in the process of identifying aquaculture opportunity areas, AOA, in Alaska's state waters, which are areas that may be environmentally, socially, and economically appropriate to support shellfish and seaweed operations. An AOA designation will be key in promoting kelp production in Alaska. Alaska Sea Grant is doing great collaborative work in this space. So, to highlight a couple things from what Senator Sullivan's office said. Senator Sullivan supports using tribal input and indigenous knowledge in kelp farming. And the kelp market, which is a big issue. I mean, kelp farmers are looking for a place to sell their kelp. Senator Sullivan sees local sales and tourists boosting the market. And Sullivan also has the goal of having an Office of Seafood at the USDA. Sullivan also supports NOAA, a government agency that does a lot with oceans. Sullivan mentioned NOAA's aquaculture opportunity areas. I'll include a link in the show notes that explains what NOAA is doing there. Next question. Would you support a statewide program to monitor coastal waters for paralytic shellfish poisoning? Answer. Although it would be up to the state to decide whether or not to implement a statewide monitoring program for paralytic shellfish toxic poisoning, Senator Sullivan believes adequate monitoring of harmful algal blooms, HABs, and testing for the HABs toxins that cause paralytic shellfish poisoning is essential for the health and safety of our communities. The importance of HAB monitoring is especially necessary for potentially impacted species that are traditional foods for Alaska natives, as well as for the commercial harvesting of clams, mussels, and oysters. For these reasons, Senator Sullivan is very supportive of federal programs that support these efforts. For example, he is the lead sponsor of S93, the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act. And then there's an acronym, maybe you would say HABRICA, to reauthorize the original HABRICA Act for coordinated, effective federal-state responses to HABs and strengthen the program to ensure the communities have access to HAB observation data, training in HAB monitoring, prevention and mitigation, and access for HAB toxins. The original HABRICA Act was passed in 1998 and established an interagency task force to assess the distribution of HABs and their impacts on coastal waters and human health. On September 12, 2025, S93 passed the Senate by unanimous consent, demonstrating the strong bipartisan support for HABs monitoring and acknowledgement of the danger HABs and paralytic shellfish poisoning pose to our ecosystems and communities. So, a big part of this answer is this piece of legislation. I'll call it S93, which the Senator's office says helps with monitoring of harmful algal blooms that cause paralytic shellfish toxins. I'll include a link in the show notes to this particular S93. Another thing I wanted to mention is the bipartisan support for S93. I have found that as I research politics and mariculture, ocean farming doesn't seem to have the deep divide other political and environmental issues have right now. Which makes me wonder, could mariculture help our country come together a little better? Perhaps yet another topic for a future episode. So, moving on to question 3. What's your favorite shellfish or seaweed dish? Answer. Every Christmas Eve, Senator Sullivan and his wife Julie make Alaska seafood Newburg with Alaska-caught shrimp, scallops, and king crab. You can find the recipe here. There's a link to a Facebook page with a recipe. I'll include a screenshot so you don't have to go to Facebook. Every time I click on that site, I lose a half hour and then have to remember what I went on there for. This Alaska seafood Newburg looks relatively easy to make. It calls for a dry sherry, which I don't have any in my pantry. So if you're looking for a substitute, I see some people use white wine, sometimes even apple cider vinegar. And one person on Reddit recommended prune juice as a sherry substitute. I'll also include the photo that's with the recipe in the show notes. There's the senator and Mrs. Sullivan. The senator is all dressed for church with an apron on and an outstretched arm stirring the pot. It kind of reminds me of my kids when I let them flip pancakes. Moving on to question 4. Do you have any other thoughts on Alaskan mariculture? Senator Sullivan believes the mariculture industry is a promising economic opportunity for Alaska. Alaska has many of the elements necessary to continue to grow our mariculture industry. Clean and abundant waters, citizens with maritime experience, existing seafood infrastructure, university and industry research capacity, and well-developed seafood marketing organizations. Senator Sullivan also recognizes that there are still a variety of challenges facing the mariculture industry. Startup costs are high, the markets are not well developed, permitting reform is needed, and some mariculture species, such as seaweed, are fragile and must be processed almost immediately, which can be challenging in remote areas, to be commercially viable. The senator looks forward to working with the state, our tribes, and coastal communities, and NOAA to address the challenges to grow this exciting industry. So in this answer, the senator cites the big problems for seaweed farming. It can be expensive. You have to buy a boat, gear, pay for permits, pay for labor, especially if you can't lift 50 pounds yourself, or you have to work for free a bit. The permitting process takes a long time. Seaweed processing in Alaska is hard, and there's not much of a market. Sullivan balances this all with its potential and how Alaska is a good place to farm seaweed. Speaking of a good place to farm seaweed, there's some good spots here in Sitka. I asked the same 4 questions to Rebecca Himschoot, who represents Sitka in the Alaska House of Representatives in District 2. Himschoot is an independent and will be running for re-election in the November 2026 election. I called her office and double-checked that she was in the election. District 2 contains a large slice of southeast Alaska along the coast with probably many more good spots to start a seaweed or oyster farm. Before we get into these questions, I just want to give you some background and a breakdown of the Alaska House of Representatives. So there's 40 members, 5 of whom, including Himschoot, are independent or unaffiliated. There's more Republican members than Democrats, but all the Democrats created a caucus with the independents and 2 Republicans to create a majority caucus. This could all change in the next election in November 2026. All the seats are up for election. Each Alaska House district has the same amount of voters, around 17 or 20,000. So in rural areas, the districts, like District 2, can stretch over a bit of land. District 2 covers 23,000 square miles, with such towns starting from the north as Yucatan, Pelican, Tenakee Springs, Petersburg, they sometimes call it Little Norway, Sitka, Cake, Port Alexander, Nocatee Bay. In a past episode, we talked to Josie, who spent a summer at an oyster farm there in Nocatee. Then there's Klewak, Hollis, Craig, and more. Wow. It's really, it's a lot of land. I asked Himschoot the same 4 questions I asked Sullivan, and here are the responses. Himschoot wrote me an email. Question 1. What do you think would best promote kelp production in Alaska? Answer. The infusion of support through the Southeast Conference Mariculture Cluster is a pretty good start to promoting kelp production. It's not as simple as just saying we want to grow more kelp. There has to be infrastructure to process the kelp, and there has to be a market. That is what is so positive about the work the Mariculture Cluster is doing. It's focusing on the markets and the infrastructure that will make kelp farming more viable. So I just want to put a couple things in context. The Southeast Conference Mariculture Cluster is a group that promotes mariculture. They're in charge of managing this huge grant that got given to Alaska to help mariculture get started here. It's a $49 million grant from the Economic Development Administration, Build Back Regional Challenge. This was part of a $1 billion grant under the Biden administration that went out across the United States to grow various industries. The Mariculture Cluster has used that money to help give loans to ocean farmers, develop the workforce by supporting programs like the one I attended at the University of Alaska Southeast in Sitka. The grant also helps with research, market development, green energy, and more. I'll provide a link to the Mariculture Cluster in the show notes. But moving on, question 2. Would you support a statewide program to monitor coastal waters for paralytic shellfish poisoning? There is a clear need for PSP monitoring, and I would have to learn more about the gaps between tribal monitoring systems for subsistence and personal use and the state system for commercial products. There could be room for increased synergy between existing monitoring efforts. Ooh, I think there's an idea here for another future episode. The gaps between tribal monitoring and the state system. Himschoot's answer is similar to the one I got from Tom Begich in our last episode, where he also needed more information about this whole paralytic shellfish poison HABs monitoring system we have in Alaska. All right, question 3. What's your favorite shellfish or seaweed dish? Answer. I'm a fan of barnacle kelp products. Pretty much all of them. Little note here. Barnacle Foods is one of the big kelp producers of kelp goods here in Alaska. They have kelp hot sauce, which I really like on baked potatoes. They have shortbread cookies with kelp in them. I visited their production place in Juneau and got a bunch of their stuff. My favorite thing I got from them, sadly, wasn't a seaweed product. However, it was these little licorice fish from Sweden. They're delicious. I love licorice. I should ask Representative Himschoot the best place to get licorice in District 2. Anyway, to take a quick sound break, I visited Barnacle in Juneau. I didn't record audio inside their facility. I felt I didn't want to breach any industrial secrets, but I did step outside right after and try to recreate them for you. Here's a little.
We were inside the Barnacle plant in the processing area. I didn't want to record because it was a private space, but you could hear like the shh, like a sound of like some kind of vacuum system, some kind of shh machinery, and then you hear the stomp stomp. They have these glass jars full of like the chili crisp. They're kind of scrapes, like a scrape, and then like a tap, tap, tap. They were like tapping the jars down to get the chili crisp level. Tap, 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 tap. Scrape, tap, tap, tap. Those were the sounds I remember. They also had these big like coffee roaster dryers that were like, I think that was kind of a sound. And yeah, it was pretty loud. Like, tap, 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 scrape, and just general machinery, sounds.
All right. The last question to Representative Himschoot. Question 4. Do you have any other thoughts on Alaskan mariculture? Answer. It's exciting to see mariculture grow in Southeast, and I am especially encouraged by the knowledge sharing I have seen between oyster farmers and between kelp growers. And I have to give a major shout out to the work being done at UAS to support this sector. I'll provide another link to the Alaska Aquaculture Program at the University of Alaska Southeast, UAS, in the show notes. But in conclusion, so today we heard some questions from the community about the environmental impacts of ocean farming with a concern about increasing otter populations in an area. I'll look into that. We also heard from 2 politicians, both in office and both up for re-election in November 2026. Sullivan wants an Office of Seafood at the USDA. Sullivan has also supported legislation about monitoring harmful algal blooms. And then we heard from local Representative Rebecca Himschoot, who praised the work of the Southeast Conference Mariculture Cluster in the University of Alaska Southeast. Himschoot would also like to know about the gaps between local and state monitoring programs for HAPs. We had some vocab words and new terms, such as Build Back Better Regional Grant, Aquaculture Opportunity Areas, Alaska Sea Grant, Southeast Conference Mariculture Cluster, Sea Otter, Abalone. I'll include a list and even more links to these in the show notes. I hope to hear from more candidates in the upcoming November election, especially the candidates for governor and Mary Patola, who is running against Dan Sullivan. I think there's like 16 candidates for governor. In the last episode, we heard from 3. That's like 13 left to go. Lucky me. Special thanks to Representative Rebecca Himschoot, United States Senator Dan Sullivan, and to Sienna Joy, who works in Sullivan's office on oceans and fisheries. I actually asked Sienna if she would be a guest on the show. I thought listeners might be curious how to work on mariculture issues at the federal level, but Sienna said the senator's press team wouldn't allow it. Sienna was kind enough to offer a bit of advice, suggesting work at an internship in the Alaska legislature or Congress in D.C., or even Alaska Sea Grant. That would be a good start. Oh, and I don't know the names of the people in Himschoot's office, but they were incredibly helpful with my questions. I called them a couple times about Himschoot's plans for 2026, questions about the size of the district, and more. Thanks, Representative Himschoot's staff. And more thanks to Alaska Sea Grant, the University of Alaska Southeast Sitka campus, Professor Angela Bowers, Professor Quentin Fong, Aldo Griffo-Hahn, Sarah Ebersol, Brenna Hawkinson, musical producer Walden Murphy, who performs piano and ukulele for Mariculture Minute, And thanks for listening to Mariculture Minute. I'm Jeremiah Murphy, and I have more stories on Alaskan politics and mariculture coming soon. You can find Mariculture Minute on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I'm on Instagram at Kelp Show and Substack at kelpshow.com, where you can leave comments or contact me with show ideas or questions. Thanks again for listening. I hope you get to go outside today. In Sitka, Alaska, I'm Jeremiah Murphy. We had some northern lights last night, and there was this moonrise too. It looked kind of creepy. Like the sun was rising at like 9:30 at night. The sky looked really weird. I thought the world was ending, but we're still here.